And the question I kind of have is that as you look around the world, you look around your life, you look around your family, you look around your interactions. Do you see challenges and you're just kind of like, man, I wish I could make a difference. I wish there was something I could do that would somehow make things better. I struggle with it all the time. Oftentimes people share with me the things that they're going through, and so often I don't know what to do. And it is a real challenge for all of us. And so as we kind of finish up the series we've been in, I want to kind of address that idea of how do we make a difference. Now, as you recall, the series has been Christianity step by step. But what I really wanted us to understand, if we look at what we've talked about over the 3 parts of the series, what this is really about is how to make a difference. Right? If we look at the sort of things that we have talked about throughout this, there's really kind of, the 3 things that we've addressed. Right now, all the stuff that we've talked about comes from this guy named James, who we know from the New Testament, who wrote what we call the book of James, which is actually just a letter to a bunch of churches. And James is kind of a really interesting person because he was Jesus' brother, yet he did not believe in Jesus. He thought Jesus was out of his mind, is the language the Bible uses. But following Jesus' death and resurrection, James came to believe that Jesus is who he said he is. And James ultimately became a very influential member and actually leader in the first century church. And so James has this kind of really pragmatic view of things. And if we look at what we talked about the first week, what was James' whole point the first week? Right? Don't make things difficult for people who are turning to God. Right? Don't let your own preconceived ideas about how things are supposed to work or specific religious traditions, right? Don't let those things get in the way of people turning to God, that everybody's journey is different. And if you're someone who's put your faith in Jesus, it's our responsibility as a person to put your faith in Jesus to assist that process, to not interfere with that process. That's James' entire point the first week. And then the second week, he talked about this idea of true religion is caring for, his words, widows and orphans in their need. Other words, the people who are most vulnerable among us, that it's our responsibility to actually care for people in need, right? That's why we have the pantry. That's why we support the soup kitchen. That's why we do work with the schools, with the homeless, with those struggling with addiction, because that's what we're called to do. Jesus says that this is what I want you to be doing. So as we wrap up today, the thing I'd like to talk about is the power of our words. How important the things that we say are. Right? And so each week I've kind of looked at kind of one specific thing that James makes a point about. And this is what James says about the power of our words. And just kind of before I get into this particular couple verses, if you read the book of James, James talks a lot about how important what we say is, and how we say it, and how it impacts people. And this is something that he really considered to be a critical point in kind of living life well. So he says here that, for we all stumble in many ways, and if anyone does not stumble in what he says, he is a perfect man, and able to bridle also his whole body. So he starts out by saying that, you know what? We all get things wrong, right? We all do things that are harmful to other people. We all do things that are harmful to ourselves sometimes. Right, to kind of use the church word, is we all sin, right? We all do things that are harmful at times. But he says, you know what? If you can get a handle on what you say, if you can get a handle on the way you talk to people, if you can get a handle on that, the rest of it's going to start to come together on its own. That if you can start to be a person who doesn't gossip about people, who doesn't belittle people, who doesn't talk to people aggressively, who doesn't say things that are hurtful and harmful. If you can do that, he says that the rest of our lives will start to come into focus, kind of more in line with the sort of person we want to be. Because the thing that he wants us to understand is our words tie to so much of our existence. That the sort of things we think and feel are tied to the words we use. And oftentimes even the actions that we take are tied to the words that we use. And I think we all kind of know this, right? Like, if you were to go grocery shopping, And it was one of those days where you're behind a person who did like that horrible thing, like they wrote a check in the grocery store. And you're like, oh, come on, am I the only one that goes, really, you're writing a check? Really? Really? You know, the person writes a check, you know, and the cashier deals with it fantastically. That she's like speedy, gets it done. Turns out that some of the things that you bought, the scanner codes aren't in place. So they have to go ahead and go send someone to go look for it. But she does an awesome job. She calls somebody over. They go take care of it. You know, the bag's ripped. She's kind of bagging things, but she still deals with it fantastically. And she stays pleasant the whole time. That's a great experience. Now, one of our temptations when everything goes well is that we kind of walk off and we don't even really think about it anymore. But now let's go the other way. All those same things happen, and the person who's checking you out is grumpy about it. Takes forever doing everything. They pack things all wrong. You get home, your food's smashed. It's all a mess. We often don't even delay to go talk about that, do we? When things are positive, we kind of move on because, I guess I don't think about it. When things go poorly, we can't wait to tell somebody about it. And what happens is as we talk about it, we generally get angrier about it or more upset about it because we kind of keep replaying it. In fact, maybe we replay it a whole bunch and then we go talk about it. And what is the effect of that? Well, now, particularly if you're in most of us live in smaller towns. Even Concord's not that large. But down where I live, it's a couple thousand people. So if I start bad-mouthing the cashier, everyone knows who I'm talking about. And now that person starts thinking differently. The person I've told starts thinking differently about the cashier. Now you've impacted that person's reputation. And then next thing you know, like you're in line and the only one that's available is that one. And you've got it so angry, like, I try to avoid her line, right? Right? People do that sort of thing. And what happens is that you actually kind of walk up with kind of a bad attitude before you even get there. And she could do everything perfectly. And you'd still find something. I'd still find something. Because the words we use and the way we talk about people, all those things impact our own experience of life, but also they impact the people that we talk about and they impact the people that we talk to other people about. Right? It kind of creates a big mess. But what it shows us is that there is a clear connection between our words, our thoughts, our emotions, and our actions. Now, as you recall that I've mentioned that if you look at the sort of things that James talks about in this letter, they generally reinforce things that Jesus talked about in what we call the Sermon on the Mount. Right? The Sermon on the Mount is this kind of one of the biggest sermons we have documented of Jesus, that there's a huge crowd of, we're told, thousands of people. And he talks a lot about this thing called the kingdom of God. And he talks about what it's like to be in connection with God, to live a life in connection with God. And one of the things he talks about is this issue between the connection between our words, our thoughts, and our actions. But now when Jesus talks about it, he actually kind of goes from a slightly different direction. He actually kind of jumps right to the action, right to the outcome, and kind of sets it up going, hey, well, this is what the outcome looks like, but let's think about how we got here. This is what Jesus says. He says, you have heard that it was said to the people long ago, you shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. And so he's hitting a point that I think we would largely all agree on, that murder is wrong. I don't think there's a lot of dissent on murder being wrong. And so he says that this action itself is actually wrong. But notice the way he says it, that you've heard that it was said. In other words, like maybe there's more to the story. And one of the things that was kind of a real challenge in the first century was the religious leaders of that time had gotten very good at kind of walking right on the edge of things. Saying that, well, as long as you don't actually do that, it's okay. You can get really close to it, and that's all right. But as long as you don't do that thing, it's okay. And what Jesus wanted to make clear was that there's harm all the way through. Because he says, yes, anyone who commits murder, right, is subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. So Jesus is saying that not just the act itself was harmful, but even that emotion that led to it, that anger that drove us there. And then he continues, he says, again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, Raka, is answerable to the court. Anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of the fire of hell. Now, first of all, remember this was not written in English. So where it says fire of hell, what he actually says, the actual original text is in danger of Gehenna. Gehenna was a place that was metaphorically a place of judgment. So he's still kind of saying that you're subject to judgment. And I want to chastise you all for saying Raka all the time. Because I know I personally struggle with the word Raka. Right? But do you know what Raka actually means? It's actually Aramaic. It means empty-headed. Kind of an airhead, but meaner. Right? Kind of like you're worthless. And so Jesus is saying that if you tell someone that they're worthless, that you're a fool, what he's saying is those things, saying those things, are also subject of judgment. Now, the point here is not to say that every thing you say, think, and do is wrong. But what he's saying is, and what he wants us to understand, is that all of these things create harm. Right? All of these things are harmful, starting with the emotion itself, because it really impacts the way you see someone, the way you feel about someone. But also things come out of that. Right? So that what he wants us to understand here is that we don't want to wait until we're on the edge of the action to try to stop ourselves. What he wants us to see is that if we can just be aware of our thoughts and interrupt things much earlier, right? Because here's what happens, right, is that anger doesn't generally come out of nowhere. You generally will have a thought about something, you'll remember something, you'll think something. And what he wants us to do is say, grab a hold of it then. Your thoughts happen. We all have thoughts, right, that maybe we'd rather not have. But you have a choice. You can dwell on it and follow it out to its natural conclusion of growing into anger and then growing into hurtful words and then growing into hurtful actions. Or you can say, I know where this is going to lead. I know where this road goes. So I'm going to deal with it at the front. When that thought comes up that I know is going to lead me towards anger, I'm going to actually control over it and put it away. Or if I can't put it away on my own, to surrender it to God, to try to get past that, to get through it. That what he wants us to understand is that these pieces all tie together. The Apostle Paul actually gives the advice to take every thought captive. In other words, when something is rising up inside of you and it's not where you want to be and it's not where you want to go, don't dwell on it. Put it away. Because otherwise, it changes everything. Because as that thought and we dwell on it, the anger starts to grow. And we begin to think negatively about a person. And I think I'm safe in saying this. We have all done this. Where you get angry about something somebody does, and you start finding all other things wrong with them. I don't even like the way they do their hair, right? Like, it's just like everything about them becomes a problem because we dwell on the anger. And so Jesus says, put that away. Because if we don't, before long we're gossiping about them, we're complaining about them, and then it starts to play out. But we start to belittle them sometimes. We actually say hurtful things directly to them. Or we do the other thing, the infamous passive-aggressive. Like you go by their house and you see their furniture and go, whoa, that's bold. Most people wouldn't do that, but you're special. You're a bold person to buy a sofa that looks like that. Right? Like you're pretending like it's a compliment, but you're trying to put them down. Right? Or you say something really hurtful and you go, oh, just kidding. Oh, you're a mess. Oh, just kidding. Right? All those things hurt. Right? And all those things are inconsistent with the way Jesus calls us to treat people. Right? That those things are harmful because they impact people in real ways. And remember, what does Jesus call us to do? Well, how does he tell us to treat people? He says, a new command I give you. Love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. Right? So he was actually said this to his disciples, those who follow him. In other words, if you've put your faith in Jesus, you are a disciple. He says to his disciples, here's how I want you to treat people. Look at how I treated people. And he says a new command. And what that shows us is that he is God, because only God could give commands. In other words, God could set laws. And Jesus says, this is the new one that I'm giving you. In fact, in a different conversation, somebody asked Jesus, like, what is the most important command? And Jesus said, well, love God with all your heart, mind, and soul, and love your neighbor as you love yourself. That those together, in fact, he says, those two things, if you will do those two things, love God and love your neighbor as you love yourself, he says the entire law and prophets are encapsulated in that. What he's saying is that every single thing that in what we know as the Old Testament, the Ten Commandments, the book of Leviticus, which is the book of the law, all these things, he says, if you will do those two things, you have fully encapsulated everything that God has captured in what we call the Old Testament. But now we're thinking back, well, but you're just talking about words, right? I mean, are words that big a deal, really? I mean, are words really unloving? Now, I think we've probably all heard some unloving words, and we had no doubt when somebody said something to us that it wasn't loving. And I suspect that we've all said things to someone who weren't, that those things were not loving. And so words do matter. And so, but if they're just words, I mean, are words really that bad? Oh, I lost my temper and I called him an idiot. Like, what's the big deal? And they're just words. Well, James, going back to what James tells us, James provides clarity on this. James says is that, well, if you think they're just words and they're just not that big a deal, James says is that I'd like you to consider looking at it this way. He says, brothers and sisters, do not slander one another. Anyone who speaks against a brother or sister or judges them speaks against the law and judges it. When you judge the law, you're not keeping it, but you're sitting in judgment of it. And what he's saying, when he says the law, what he's saying is, when Jesus said, love others as I have loved you. So James is saying that when you choose to be judgmental of someone, when we choose to slander someone, when I choose to do those things, what James is saying is that if I do that, he's saying that I've made the decision to go, you know what? Particularly for me, right? I know what Jesus says. And I'm saying, I don't care. I don't care what Jesus said. I've made the decision to say that that's not that important. So he says, when you know the law, when you know that Jesus has said, love others as I have loved you, and you are someone who's chosen to put your faith in Jesus, choosing to use hurtful words is basically saying, Jesus, yes, I know what you've asked me to do, and honestly, I just don't think it's that important. I mean, I'll be honest with you. As I was writing this sermon a couple weeks ago, I was convicted big time. Because, if we're honest, we all say things sometimes we wish we wouldn't say. And not even necessarily to people, but about people. None of you, of course. None of you. Right? But we all struggle with that, right? And it made me really realize is that there were things that I would say that were not consistent what Jesus has called me to do. That all of those things, what we say to people, what we say about people, really, really matters. It really has an effect. So, what should we do? Remember how James started this out, right? James started out saying that if you could get control of your words, the rest of your life, the rest of the pieces would start to come together. So what should we do? Well, here's what James suggests. A couple of very basic principles. He says, my dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. So he says, prioritize listening. The only thing we're supposed to be quick to do in this is quick to listen. To give the person who you're talking to a chance to talk. And actually listen to them. Don't wait to talk, right? Don't just wait for your turn to talk. Or maybe not wait for your turn to talk, which I struggle with sometimes. But take your time and listen. And consider what that person has to say. Make sure they have time to make their point. Make sure you take time to understand, right? Slow to speak. In other words, don't look to jump into it, right? Because if we're honest, we can be in a conversation with someone and they'll say something and our first thought is to react, right? To react to something they've said, to try to rebut something they've said, to push back on something they've said. And he's saying, just kind of slow it down a little bit. Consider what they've said. And take the time to figure out how to respond. And respond in a way that's productive, right? That is thoughtful, right? Be patient in your response. If you can be patient, thoughtful, and productive, once you've put all that together, right? That's being slow to speak, taking that time, because you can make your point with lots of different words. Some are far more productive than others. He says, so take our time to be productive, to be patient. Now, notice the last thing he says there is to be slow to become angry. Why should we be slow to become angry? Well, hopefully you have some idea, after the past 15 minutes or so. But basically, he says, be slow to become angry because human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires. Right? And this is really the point that Jesus was making, that anger doesn't produce righteousness, it produces dark things. It doesn't have to be murder to be hurtful. All the way through the words we use, all the way out to the way we treat people. And the thing is that as we think about this idea of being angry, people have said this to me a bunch of times. You know what? Jesus got angry, so it must be okay. And James is kind of saying, well, Jesus' anger was righteous. Your anger may not be righteous. I'm not saying it never is righteous, but it may not be righteous. Because we want to really, really be careful about saying our anger is righteous. And particularly as we point to Jesus saying, well, Jesus got angry because, he flipped those tables, right? He must have been angry about something. And he was. But if you read through the Gospels, and all the situations where Jesus got angry, they always fell into one of three categories. Every time he got angry at people, they always fell into one of three categories. One, when religious people chose religious ritual over human well-being. When religious people chose religious ritual over human well-being. He told one of his most famous parables about that, the Good Samaritan. Right, that when basically there's a guy laying on the roadside, injured and hurt and bleeding. And the religious leaders walk by going, I got to get to church. I don't have time to deal with this guy right now. Or Jesus tells another scenario where he says, hey, if you're standing in line at the temple to make your offering, and you realize that someone has something negative against you, put down your offering, go deal with that person, make things right, and then after things are right, then come back and do the church stuff. Put human well-being above the church stuff. That was the point. And when people didn't do that, that made Jesus angry. Now that's the first one. The second one, this is the one about the flipping tables. When people actually used religion to take advantage of people. Right? When he flips the tables, it's because these people are selling a bunch of overpriced things to pilgrims who are coming to the temple. For many people, that was a very long journey. And so they couldn't bring everything with them that they needed. So people set up along the temple and sold overpriced items to these people who traveled so far. And that's what made Jesus furious. And the third situation that made Jesus angry goes back to when parents were trying to bring their children to meet Jesus. And the disciples got in the middle of it and said, he doesn't have time for this. Take them away. And the Bible actually says Jesus was indignant. In other words, he was angry. So what was he angry about? Because people were interfering with someone coming to know him. Particularly the young, particularly the innocent. So if that's what you're angry about, that's righteous. But if we're honest with ourselves, what most commonly makes us angry? We can't do something we want. We didn't get something we want. We can't go somewhere we want. Right? It's not to say that there aren't other things. But in general, our anger does not fit into that righteous bucket. In general, our anger is more about our own things. Not saying there aren't other examples that are valid, but we want to really be careful about that. And the thing is that he wants us to understand, that James wants us to understand, as I wrap this up, James wants us to understand that our words are so important and our words have so much power. So what James actually says to us here is that with our mouths, we bless our Lord and Father, and with our mouth, we curse people who are made in the likeness of God. From the same mouth come blessing and cursing. James is saying that the words that we use make a difference, right? That our words can be a blessing or they can be a curse. Our words can be positive or our words can be negative. And the thing that I want to ask us all to kind of take away with us from this, to choose to use words of blessing. That if you will actually make a conscious effort to use words of blessing consistently in every situation, to use words that are a blessing, your actions will naturally follow that. Your actions will naturally be consistent with being a blessing. And if you're going to really consistently use words of blessing, there's only one way to do that. Think consistently in terms of being a blessing. In other words, when you encounter a situation, your mind has to go to, okay, I've got options here. I can do nothing. I could do or say something negative. But I'm going to try to find the positive thing that I can do in this situation. And if we start to do that consistently in our lives, consistently and consciously saying that in every situation, I'm going to do my best to be a conscious blessing in this scenario to make a difference. That if we will do that, that will actually reshape the way that we think. We will actually begin to see the world differently. We'll begin to experience the world differently. It doesn't mean there aren't hard things. It doesn't mean there aren't bad things. Of course there still are bad things. But we can be one of the things that aren't bad. We can be one of the things that actually is good, that brings good, that does good. And that begins with being conscious about the words that we use. Right? That as we kind of bring this all around, that if we can actually internalize, there's kind of 3 points. Right? That if we can actually say that, you know what? I'm going to be someone who doesn't make it difficult for people who are turning to God. I'm not going to have my own preconceived ideas and lay those on other people. I'm going to let them have their own journey, but support them in their journey. Right? To choose words of blessing consistently, to begin to see the world more as a view of blessing. And then to consciously do things that make a difference in other people's lives. Right? That's the invitation that's extended to us. That's what God, through Jesus, is calling us to do.